Welcome to the Missing Ledger, where the world's most baffling disappearances, unsolved mysteries, cold cases, and hidden truths come back to life. Tonight's story takes you deep into a real mystery filled with unanswered questions, forgotten evidence, and shocking discoveries. Stay with us until the very end. You might uncover details that change the way you see this case forever. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the Missing Ledger and turn on notifications so you never miss a new mystery. If you enjoy stories like this, leave a like. It really helps the channel grow and allows us to bring you more fascinating investigations. Now tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We'd love to know which part of the world is joining us for today's mystery. Now settle in, and let's uncover another missing piece of the ledger. For 47 years, the town of Piney Bend told itself a story about the night the creek took the Tucker children. And for 47 years, almost everyone who told it believed every word. It happened, according to that story, on the night of June 3, 1978, when a summer storm dropped 6 inches of rain on the hills above Piney Bend in under 4 hours, and sent the normally gentle creek behind the Tucker family's farmhouse into a flood that tore out 2 footbridges and half a hillside of pine. Wendell Tucker, a widower raising 5 children alone since his wife's death 2 years earlier, told the sheriff the next morning that he had gone out to check the henhouse in the worst of the storm and come back to find the children's bedroom windows open and all 5 of them gone. Ellis, 12. Marguerite, called Rita, 10. Dovey, 8. Sam, 6. And June, 3, the baby, named for the month she was born in. No bodies were ever recovered from the creek, though searchers dragged nearly 4 miles of it over the following 2 weeks. No bodies were ever recovered anywhere. The sheriff's department at the time, working with next to no resources and a storm that had washed away most physical evidence within hours, eventually filed the case as a presumed drowning. 5 children lost to a flash flood in the dark, their father the only living witness to a tragedy that had, conveniently and permanently, erased every trace of what had actually happened to them. It took a DNA test purchased as a Christmas gift in 2024 and a genetic genealogist with a stubborn streak to finally unmake that story. Ren Callahan had built a small, well-regarded career doing exactly the kind of work most people assumed belonged only to true crime podcasts. Using consumer DNA databases, painstaking family tree reconstruction, and a genealogist's patience to identify unknown remains and unidentified perpetrators in cases that had gone cold decades before she was born. She worked freelance, mostly for county sheriff's offices too small to have their own genetic genealogy unit. And in March 2025, a detective from a department 3 states from Piney Bend sent her a routine request. Help identify the biological family of a woman named Grace Whitfield, who had grown up believing she was adopted through entirely legal channels in 1978 and had recently begun asking harder questions after her adoptive parents' deaths left her sorting through a strongbox of documents that didn't add up. Grace had taken a consumer DNA test the previous Christmas, more out of curiosity than any real expectation of answers. What came back unsettled her enough to hire Ren directly. A first cousin matched to a woman in a completely different state, and buried further down the list, a much stranger result. A segment of shared DNA suggesting a full sibling relationship to 4 other users in the same database, none of whom, according to their public profiles, had ever heard of Grace Whitfield, and none of whom shared a single recorded ancestor with the family that had raised her. She thought it might be a database error. Ren told Detective Renata Cole's colleague, State Investigator Priya Nayar, the first time they spoke by phone. Nayar had picked up the case after Ren's initial findings made it clear this wasn't a simple adoption reunion anymore. It wasn't an error. It was 5 siblings who'd been split apart and placed with 5 completely unrelated families, decades ago, in a way that left almost no legitimate paperwork behind. Wren spent 6 weeks building out the family tree before she found the name that cracked the case wide open. Wendell Tucker, a Kentucky sharecropper's son turned Piney Bend farmhand, widower, father of 5, whose children had drowned in a 1978 flash flood according to a newspaper clipping she found in a digitized county archive. A story that matched the birth years and rough ages of all 5 of her DNA matches almost exactly. Drowned children don't take DNA tests 47 years later, Wren said. I called Priya that same night. What Wren and Nayar reconstructed over the following months was not one reunion story but 5, each stranger than the last, because none of the Tucker children had grown up anywhere near each other, and none of them, until the DNA results arrived, had any reason to suspect the others existed, let alone that they shared blood. Grace Whitfield, born Dovey Tucker, age 8 in 1978, had been raised in a comfortable, loving home 2 states away by a couple who told her only that she'd been adopted as an infant through a private arrangement, a story that never quite matched her own hazy, dreamlike memories of a farmhouse, a creek, and siblings whose faces she could no longer picture but whose voices, she told Nayar during her first formal interview, she still sometimes heard in dreams. Marguerite Tucker, Rita, had been placed with a family in the Midwest and renamed Marguerite Voss, growing up to become a school teacher, married with 2 grown children of her own, who had spent much of her adult life with a persistent, unexplained sense that she was missing memories she should have had, a feeling she'd mentioned to therapists for years without ever finding a satisfying answer. Ellis Tucker, the oldest, had been placed at age 12, old enough, investigators would later determine, to have made his adoption dramatically harder to arrange quietly, which was likely why his file, once finally located, showed the roughest edges of the entire operation. 2 failed placements before a family in a neighboring county finally took him in as a foster child rather than a formal adoption, a status that left him with a legal identity so tangled it took Nayar's team nearly a month just to confirm he was, in fact, alive. Sam Tucker had died in 1991, at age 19, in a car accident that had nothing whatsoever to do with the case. An ordinary tragedy that meant one of the 5 siblings would never sit across a table from Nayar or hear the truth about what had happened to his family, a fact that struck Wren when she found the obituary, harder than almost anything else in the investigation. And June Tucker, the baby, 3 years old in 1978, had been placed with a couple who never told her she was adopted at all. She had lived her entire life under a different name, in a different state, with no memory of Piney Bend whatsoever, and when Nayar finally tracked her down in the spring of 2025, June was 49 years old, a grandmother herself, and had absolutely no idea that the phone call she was about to receive would unravel everything she believed about her own childhood. The name that appeared, again and again, in every fragment of paperwork Wren and Nayar managed to recover, hospital discharge notes, a handwritten ledger eventually found in a collapsing boarding house on the edge of Piney Bend, 3 separate adoptive families' recollections of the woman who had arranged everything, was Corrine Hargrove. In 1978, Hargrove had run what she publicly described as a private children's placement service out of a large boarding house on Route 9, ostensibly helping desperate mothers and troubled families find loving homes for children they couldn't care for, at a time when formal adoption agencies were scarce in rural counties and informal, church-adjacent placement arrangements were common enough that almost no one thought to question them closely. Privately, according to the ledger investigators eventually recovered, Hargrove had built something far more calculated, a network of wealthy, childless couples across 5 states willing to pay substantial sums, quietly and in cash, for healthy children with no complicated legal trail behind them, and a working relationship with a local doctor, since deceased, willing to falsify birth records and death certificates as needed to make those children's origins disappear entirely. Wendell Tucker, drowning in debts from his late wife's medical bills and increasingly unable, by his neighbors' later accounts, to manage 5 children alone, had approached Hargrove in the spring of 1978, according to the ledger's own chillingly businesslike notation. W. Tucker, 5 units, flood cover arranged, payment schedule attached. The storm on June 3 had been real. The flood had been real. But the children's disappearance had not been an accident swept up in it. It had been the cover story Hargrove herself had suggested, timed deliberately to coincide with weather severe enough to destroy physical evidence and provide a plausible, unquestionable explanation for 5 children vanishing from one farmhouse in a single night. She used the storm, Nayar told a stunned county board 18 months into the investigation, once the full scope of the ledger's contents had been verified. She didn't cause it, but she used it exactly the way a criminal uses any gift the world hands them. 5 children were placed with 5 different families within 11 days of that flood, and every single receiving family was told a version of the same story. A young, unmarried mother giving up children she couldn't keep, no living relatives to complicate the arrangement, a clean legal transfer already handled. None of it had been true, all of it had been paid for. The boarding house on Route 9 had stood empty since Hargrove's death in 1996, slowly collapsing under decades of neglect, owned by a distant relative who had never done more than pay the property taxes and let the building rot. It was scheduled for demolition in the fall of 2025 when Nayar's investigation reached it, acting on a tip from an elderly former Piney Bend postal worker who remembered, as a young man, delivering unusually heavy parcels to the house every few months throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, parcels, he told Nayar, that Hargrove had always insisted on signing for personally, at the door, never letting the carrier step inside. What investigators found in the house's sealed attic, once a structural engineer confirmed the floor could bear the weight of a search team, was Hargrove's complete operation laid out in obsessive, damning detail. Ledgers listing at least 31 children placed between 1971 and 1983, correspondence with adoptive families across 5 states, photographs, dozens of them, children posed stiffly in front of a blank wall, the same wall investigators eventually identified as a section of the boarding house's own front parlor, and tucked into a separate strongbox, a stack of 5 photographs paperclipped together, labeled in Hargrove's own handwriting. Tucker, June 1978, all placed successfully. Ellis, Rita, Dovey, Sam, and June Tucker, aged 12, 10, 8, 6, and 3, stared out of those photographs with the particular flatness of children who had already been told, in whatever words a con artist chooses for a task like that, not to smile, not to cry, not to ask questions that might complicate a transaction already in progress. I found myself in that photograph before I found myself in any memory, Grace Whitfield told Nayar, the day she was shown the image of an 8-year-old girl who would not be called Dovey again for another 47 years. I didn't recognize my own face. I recognized my own eyes. Wendell Tucker had not vanished after selling his children, as investigators initially assumed he might have. He had stayed in Piney Bend for another 6 years, working the same farmhand jobs, attending the same small church, accepting the community's sympathy for his loss at every funeral and holiday gathering that followed, before finally moving to a town 2 counties over in 1984, where he lived out the rest of his life under his own name, remarried once briefly, and died in 2002 of liver failure. With no children listed as survivors in an obituary that ran 9 paragraphs and mentioned, with what Nayar found almost unbearable to read, his beloved late children, lost tragically to the creek in 1978. He had, according to 2 elderly Piney Bend residents interviewed during the investigation, wept openly at the small memorial service the community held for the 5 children that same summer. A service investigators now understood had mourned 5 living, breathing children who had, at the time it was held, already been resettled in 5 different homes hundreds of miles away. I used to think, Rita Marguerite Voss told Nayar during one of the case's hardest interviews, that if my father had really lost us in that flood, at least it meant he'd loved us enough to grieve. Finding out he sold us and then grieved anyway at a fake funeral for the neighbors to see, that's a different kind of loss. That's finding out the grief was a performance and the love probably was too. Investigators found no evidence Wendell Tucker had ever attempted to locate or contact any of his children after the transaction was complete. Whatever guilt drove him to weep at that memorial, it apparently never drove him further than that. The reunion, when it finally happened in November 2025, took place not at a police station or a courthouse, but at Grace Whitfield's own home, at her specific request. Because she had told Nayar she refused to meet the siblings she'd spent 47 years not knowing existed in any room that felt official, clinical, or owned by the same system that had spent decades failing to find any of them. Ellis arrived first, 60 years old now, a retired mechanic with a rough, weathered face and hands that shook slightly as he stood on Grace's porch. Unsure, he admitted later, whether he was allowed to knock or whether the whole thing might turn out to be some kind of mistake after all. Rita arrived 20 minutes later, still in the cardigan she'd worn to teach her last class of the day before catching a flight she'd booked the moment Nayar's call ended. And June arrived last, nervous in a way that surprised even her own adult children, who had never seen their mother anything but calm and unflappable in 50 years of family gatherings. There was no single dramatic moment of recognition, no cinematic embrace the way the news cameras camped at the end of Grace's Street had clearly hoped for. Instead, according to Nayar, who was present at the family's request, there was a long, careful silence in Grace's living room. 4 adults who shared a face's worth of features scattered across their own, Ellis's jaw on June's face, Rita's eyes on Grace's. A stubborn set to all 4 mouths that none of them had ever known came from the same source, simply looking at each other for what felt, to everyone in the room, like several minutes longer than it probably was. It was June, the baby of the family, the one with no memory of any of it at all, who finally broke the silence. "I don't remember any of you," she said, her voice unsteady. "I don't remember a single thing about being Tucker anybody. I don't know how to feel what I'm supposed to feel right now." "None of us know how to feel it either," Rita said gently, reaching for her hand. "We're allowed to figure it out slowly. We've got time now. That's the one thing that got stolen and just got given back." They talked for 6 hours that first evening, filling gaps neither DNA nor Hargrove's ledgers could ever have supplied. Small things: the shape of the farmhouse kitchen, the sound of the creek before the storm, a lullaby their mother had sung before she died that only Ellis, old enough at the time, could still half remember the tune to, and which he hummed, haltingly, for 3 siblings hearing it for the first time in 47 years. They spoke, too, carefully and briefly, about Sam, the 5th chair at the table that would remain permanently empty, a brother none of the surviving 4 had ever gotten the chance to meet as adults, whose photograph from Hargrove's strongbox now sat framed on Grace's mantel beside the other 4, so that even in his absence, the Tucker 5 could sit together in one room at last. Corrine Hargrove had been dead for nearly 30 years by the time her ledger came to light, placing her forever beyond any courtroom's reach. Wendell Tucker had died in 2002, similarly unreachable. The doctor who had falsified the children's records had died in 1989. Of everyone directly responsible for what happened to the Tucker 5, not one remained alive to answer for it in any legal sense at all. "It's one of the hardest parts of cases like this," Nayar told a regional reporter, in the single interview she agreed to give once the story broke publicly. "Sometimes the truth arrives exactly on time to heal something and exactly too late to punish anyone for breaking it in the first place. We can give these 4 siblings their history back. We were never going to be able to give them a trial. What the investigation could reach eventually were the 26 other children named in Hargrove's ledger beyond the Tucker Five, a sprawling secondary investigation that Wren Callahan continued working for another 2 years, tracking down adoptive families across 5 states, confirming identities, and in 11 cases, facilitating reunions between siblings and biological relatives who had, like the Tuckers, spent decades believing a story that had never been true. 3 of those 26 children, investigators eventually confirmed, had died in the homes Hargrove placed them in, one from what a belated, unofficial review of old medical records suggested was undiagnosed and untreated abuse, a finding that arrived far too late to help anyone but complicate, permanently, the neat story Hargrove's ledger had tried to tell about successful placements. The town of Piney Bend, faced with the unraveling of a story it had told itself sincerely for 47 years, chose in the spring of 2026 to remove the small memorial stone that had stood beside Piney Creek since 1978, the one that had read, for nearly half a century, in memory of 5 children taken by the flood. In its place, at the family's request, the town installed a new marker, smaller and less ornate than the first, bearing only 5 names, 5 birth years, and a single line the 4 surviving siblings wrote together over the course of a long, difficult afternoon at Grace's kitchen table. Not taken by the water, taken by people who should have protected them, found, eventually, by each other. Grace Whitfield returned to Piney Bend for the marker's unveiling, the first time any of the surviving siblings had set foot in the town since 1978, walking the creek bank with Rita and Ellis on either side of her while June, who had asked to stay behind at the hotel that day, watched from her window and told Nayar afterward that some homecomings simply take longer than others to arrive at, and that was allowed too. "I used to think I'd feel something standing here," Ellis said, looking down at water that had, in the end, never taken anything at all, had only ever been the weather a woman with a ledger happened to find useful. "Mostly I just feel angry that it took 47 years and a Christmas DNA kit to find out the truth was this simple. 5 children, 1 woman with a boarding house and a price list. That's it. That's the whole terrible story." Wren Callahan never stopped working the wider case, even after the Tucker reunion made headlines, and the funding for the investigation had officially wound down. 2 names from Hargrove's ledger remained unresolved by the time this account was written. 2 children, placed in 1976 and 1980 respectively, whose adoptive families' paper trails had gone cold in ways even Wren's patience hadn't yet managed to untangle. "Every ledger entry is a person," she said, describing the work to a genealogy conference the following year, in a talk that made half the room go quiet in a way conference talks rarely do. "It's easy to read 31 names in a stranger's handwriting and see a case file. It took the Tucker family showing up in my inbox to remind me that every single one of those 31 names woke up as a real child on a real morning, 40 or 50 years ago, with a life that got interrupted by an adult who decided their family's love was something with a price tag on it." She kept the 5 original photographs from Hargrove's strongbox: Ellis, Rita, Dovey, Sam, and June, aged 12, 10, 8, 6, and 3, staring flatly at a camera in front of a blank parlor wall, framed on her own office wall not as a trophy, she told the reporter who eventually profiled her work, but as a reminder of exactly how much can still be sitting in a stranger's attic, waiting for someone stubborn enough to go looking. A year after the reunion, the 4 surviving Tucker siblings began a tradition none of them had planned in advance. A dinner, held each June 3, the anniversary of the storm that had once been the whole of their story and was now only the first terrible chapter of a much longer one. They set 5 places at the table every year, the 5th chair left empty for Sam, and they took turns, Rita told Nayar during a follow-up interview 2 years later, telling stories about a childhood none of them fully remembered together, and a life apart that none of them had chosen, filling the space between those two truths a little more each year with the ordinary, unremarkable details of siblings who were, finally, simply allowed to know each other. People ask if we're angry, Rita said. We are. We probably always will be some. But anger isn't the only thing that fits at that table anymore. Some years it's mostly grief. Some years, more than I expected, it's mostly just 5 names and 4 voices, and a lot of laughing about things a family isn't supposed to laugh about, except that's exactly what families do, and we finally got to be one. Grace Whitfield keeps the photograph from the boarding house strongbox on her own mantel still, the one that started everything. 5 children who were never lost to any creek, only stolen from it and hidden in plain sight in 5 separate lives, until a DNA kit meant as a Christmas gift finally, 47 years late, brought them back into the same room to grieve and remember and begin. In memory of every child a ledger reduced to a price, and every sibling who never stopped being family, even during the decades none of them knew the others existed.